now, and they've been telling you for the past few years, is the economy is doing well. It's always the economy is doing great, but in this period of time, it was the economy is doing great, but we got to worry about deflation. Now, it's the economy is doing great, but we got to worry about global growth. To illustrate this further, let's dive into a recent CNBC interview with Fed Governor Lael Brainard. The Fed's 3 rate cuts this year amounted to significant action to help support the economy against the headwinds of slow global growth and tariffs. So the economy is doing fine, but we had to drop interest rates 3 times to levels that would have been unheard of 20 years ago to support the economy from those nasty headwinds of slow worldwide GDP growth. Well, let's check out the facts really quick. We've got GDP growth worldwide from 2012 to 2018 down here. It starts at a 2.9% growth, goes up to 3.7% growth. And here is the United States. Same thing, 2012 to 2018. It goes from 0% growth up to 3% growth, and these are adjusted for inflation. So you can see every point where I have a red arrow, here in the US GDP and down here in the worldwide GDP, it's where the GDP worldwide does the opposite of what's happening in the United States. Or, in other words, what's happening in the United States is the opposite of what happens actually out in the world. You can see in 2013, US GDP declined, but the GDP worldwide went up quite a bit. In 2015, it's really dramatic, where the worldwide GDP just tanked, fell out of bed, but our GDP rose significantly. Same thing in 2018. The worldwide GDP tanks, our GDP goes up. So there's absolutely no correlation based on these charts between the worldwide GDP growth and the United States GDP growth. So this nonsense shows that those 3 interest rate cuts aren't about global growth slowing down, but it's about the fact that the US economy can't handle anything above 0% interest rates. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt momentarily and assume that global growth does affect the United States GDP dramatically. If that's the case, then in 2013, our GDP growth would have been a lot lower than it actually was because GDP growth worldwide increased significantly. Likewise, in 2014, our GDP would have been to the moon. We would have probably a 5 or 6% GDP because worldwide GDP went way down. Moving over to 2018, our GDP again would have been way up here, above probably 5-6% level, because at that same point in time, worldwide GDP declined significantly. So if that's what the United States GDP would have looked like if it wasn't for these headwinds and tailwinds of worldwide GDP, then how can we say that during that time frame, especially in here, that we were worried about inflation? Because remember, the economy is great, but oh my gosh, we're worried about deflation. We don't want that deflation demon to come and bite us in the ankle. Or why do we need 0% interest rates? On this chart, I show when interest rates started to increase. So back in this area, when we would have had GDP growth at 5 or 6%, if it wasn't for the worldwide GDP growth bringing us down, then why did we need 0% interest rates? And where was the inflation if our economy was running that hot? The bottom line is these 2 thoughts cannot coexist. Either this has to be a lie or this has to be a lie. They both can't be true, but both of these can be false. The economy can be bad through this time frame, which is why we needed those 0% interest rates, and the economy can be bad now, which is why we're headed back down to 0% interest rates. Step number 2, the Federal Reserve's secrets that they don't want you to know about. Mainly, they want a dollar collapse. Let me explain. Brainerd, when she went on in that article, talked about a yield cap. This is another tool that they want to incorporate in addition to lowering those interest rates and quantitative easing. Let's go right back to the article and I'll show you what I'm talking about. During the financial crisis, the Fed did about $3.8 trillion in quantitative easing. Officials recently have been reviewing how effective those moves were and what can be done the next time rates fall to what central bankers call the effective lower bound. Brainerd went on to say that yield caps would bring down longer-term rates and help consumers pay for housing and other purchases. Now pay very close attention to this next statement. This is huge. The 3 rounds of quantitative easing were ineffective. And I want to emphasize that. Were ineffective in some sense, she said. So what is this yield cap that Brainerd's referring to? To understand that better, let's do a review of quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve just prints money out of nowhere. They take that money, they go into the bond market, they buy bonds. They create more demand for those bonds. If there's more demand for the bonds, we've got our little yield curve here, 2-year, 10-year, 30-year, that effectively lowers the interest rates because the higher the demand for those bonds is, the lower the interest rate goes. Now that we understand that, let's go over the yield cap, which is this new revolutionary tool that the geniuses at the Federal Reserve have come up with. I mean, it's amazing. In the yield cap, what they do is the Federal Reserve prints money out of nowhere. They take that money, they go into the bond market to buy bonds and create more demand for those bonds. And they do that because they want to try to bring down the yield curve. The more demand for the bonds, the lower the interest rates go. Now, you may be saying to yourself, what? That sounds exactly like quantitative easing. In my opinion, you would be right, but there may be some subtle differences. Let's go into a different article to see what those differences might be. This is an article from Brookings. Yield curve control is different in one major respect from QE, quantitative easing. QE deals in quantities of bonds. Under yield curve control, or yield cap, the central bank commits to buying whatever amount of bonds the market wants to supply at its target price, or interest rate. So what she's saying is that quantitative easing has a limit, a specified amount that they're going to print out of nowhere. So back when we did QE 1, 2, and 3, that was a mere 3.8 trillion. Boo, that's not going to do anything. What she wants to do is just do away with this constraint that they don't need. And they want to print limitless amounts of money just so long as they get that interest rate going down and down and down. When you look at it this way, it becomes blatantly obvious that they're not really concerned with the economy. What they're concerned with is creating inflation. And inflation does what? It devalues the dollar. Step number 3 is inflation targeting. This is the next step in their dollar collapse agenda. Let's go back to their biggest concern, or what they were telling us their concern was when they dropped interest rates to 0 for so long. Remember, they were telling us that they were doing that because they wanted to avoid deflation at all costs. As further example of this love affair that the Fed has with inflation, let's go back to that CNBC article. In addition to the rate cap talk, Brainerd also weighed some options on how to generate healthy inflation. And I want to emphasize the word healthy inflation, which has run persistently below the 2% Fed target for much of the decade-old recovery. So I want you to notice, guys, they're referring to inflation as healthy and a lack of inflation as persistently low, as though there's some sort of negative connotation to it being under 2%. So why is it that the Federal Reserve considers inflation the pinnacle of economic success? Or at least this is what they tell us. Because they're so worried about that nasty deflation dragging us down and wreaking havoc on the economy. The way it plays out, according to the Fed, is that lower prices mean lower revenue for employers. Lower revenue equals higher unemployment, and higher unemployment equals lower demand. Lower demand, it's just a feedback loop that goes right back to lower prices, and the cycle goes down and down and down and just never ends. This is the boogeyman that we should be concerned with. But let's think this through. If you're making $50,000 a year right now and your wages cut in half because of deflation and go to $25,000, let's just say in this example that your expenses, your annual expenses, were $50,000 as well. Well, your expenses would also go down to $25,000. So for you, it would be a net wash. Your standard of living would be no better or no worse. So if deflation, the way we look at it here, is really not that scary, it's not that big of a deal, what is all the fuss about? How can the Fed take this concept and pull the wool over our eyes to make us so scared of this deflation monster? Because if prices go down in our economy, that does two things. Number one, it increases the value of people's savings. You may say, well, wow, that's a great thing, and I would agree. But it also does one other thing. It increases the value or the burden of the debt. And who's the largest debtor in the history of the world? The United States government. And that takes us right back to inflation targeting. And to explain how serious they are about creating inflation to bail out the government, let's go back to the CNBC article one more time. Brainerd suggested inflation averaging, or adjusting the target based on where the level has run. For instance, if inflation ran for 1.5% for a while, the Fed could lift expectations by announcing a new 2.5% target. By committing to achieve inflation outcomes that average 2% over time, the committee would make clear in advance that it would accommodate rather than offset modest upward pressures to inflation in what could be described as a process of opportunistic reflation. And I'd love to meet the PR person that comes up with these colorful words that basically mean we want the American public to have much less purchasing power. So in English, what she's saying is that if we have 0% inflation for 5 years, for the next 5 years, the Fed would want to produce at least 4% inflation to make up for the past 5 years of 0%. But wait a minute here. I thought that the Fed was scared of deflation because they didn't want us to go through this process. So they wanted to make sure that there was a little bit of a buffer there. That's why they targeted that 2% inflation. But if we get up to 4% inflation, what does that have to do with us being any closer to deflation in the past? The answer is it doesn't. It doesn't have anything to do with the past. Nothing at all. We're in no more jeopardy of going into deflation if we're at 4% now, if in the past we were at 0%. It doesn't make any difference. So what the Fed is basically doing is they're showing us their cards without admitting it. They're saying that we don't care really about deflation. What we care about is making sure that there is enough inflation or that we collapse the dollar enough to take care of the federal government's overbloated debt. If you look at the facts and think about things critically, It becomes blatantly obvious that the Fed is lying to us and keeping secrets from us because they know that our economy is built on asset prices, debt, and confidence. And if they don't try to collapse the dollar, the debt that we have, the overwhelming debt, will completely consume the entire economy. And if they don't tell us the economy is doing well, if they actually tell the truth, they know that will destroy confidence and the whole house of cards will come tumbling down. For more information like this, check out this content right here, and I will see you on the next video.